This program is brought to you by the University of Michigan. For more information, visit umich.edu.
Saturday Morning Physics is sponsored by the Physics Department of the University of Michigan, by the Dr. M. Lois Tiffany Endowment, and by gifts from friends of the program.
Thank you all for coming out on this rainy day to hear about Buddhism and science. Saturday Morning Physics is a venerable tradition here at Michigan, and it's an honor to be able to speak to you today. Michigan is known as a place where we cross boundaries between disciplines. And I think that there is no greater evidence of that than my presence here today, because as you'll see very soon, I'm a person who knows absolutely nothing about physics, yet I've been invited to speak in this august forum. So today's event is not simply interdisciplinary, but perhaps intercultural. 50 years ago, the British scientist and novelist C.P. Snow talked about the two cultures, the cultures of the humanities and the culture of the sciences. Two different worlds inhabited by different kinds of scholars who were often opposed to each other in many ways. And whether Snow was right or not, it is the case that there are differences between the humanities and the natural sciences. As chair of the Society of Fellows, I overheard a conversation the other day between a philosopher and a theoretical physicist, and they were trying to decide which person had the lower equipment costs. And the philosopher said, well, for my research, I need a pad of paper and a pencil. And the theoretical physicist, I think it was actually a string theorist, said, well, you win. I need a pad of paper, a pencil, and a waste paper basket. There are some other differences as well. For scholars of the humanities, especially those of my age, we very rarely use PowerPoint when we speak. But in honor of this occasion, I have made 2 slides, which I'll show you in a second. And there's one other difference, which is ironic in a way, that in the sciences, it's considered rude in a way, to read to the audience, that one should speak to the audience and not read. Whereas in the humanities, it's considered rude not to read. That is, in the humanities, we feel that one indicates one's respect for the audience by using the tools of the writer's craft to compose something ahead of time, a text that one then reads. So I have to warn you, I will be reading, but I promise to look up from time to time, and I also promise to use the word physics in what I have to say. But before I begin, I wanted to show you a couple of things that in lieu of any equipment or any demonstrations, I wanted to first show you this statue of Manjushri. Manjushri is the bodhisattva of wisdom in Buddhism. He is said to be the embodiment of all the wisdom of all the Buddhas. His name means gentle glory in Sanskrit. And he holds in his left hand, he's holding the stem of a lotus flower, which then blooms over his left shoulder. And on top of that lotus blossom is a book. And if this statue were life-size, the book would look like this. This is a Buddhist text, a Tibetan text. It's called The Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 Stanzas. And I can open it up and show that to you afterwards if you'd like to see that. In his right hand, Manjushri holds the sword of wisdom that he uses to cut through the webs of ignorance. His mantra is Om Arabadza Nadi. And if you repeat that a lot, it's said to make you both more intelligent and more eloquent. So that's Manjushri. The other image is the one that you have on your flyer. This is, of course, the Buddha. So in 1996, in Shandong province in China, a team of construction workers was making a playground at an elementary school. And they unearthed a pit that contained hundreds and hundreds of broken Buddha images in limestone, granite, lacquered wood. They had been buried there in the 12th century for reasons that are unclear. And the statues themselves dated back to the 6th century. This particular image is a limestone head of the Buddha from about 560, so very ancient. Now, like the statues in ancient Rome that we think of as being just white marble, those statues, the Roman statues, were in fact painted originally. And Buddhist statues of the Buddha were also painted in China and in Japan. This one has now been resurrected after being buried for 8 centuries and given a color that no Buddhist statue ever had, electric blue. And between the eyes of the Buddha is said to have 32 marks on his body that mark him as being the superior person. One of these is called the urna in Sanskrit. That word just means tuft, a small tuft of white hair. But it's an unusual tuft of hair because the Buddha is able to emit a ray of light from that tuft of hair and illuminate the entire universe. So here, the urna has been replaced by the international symbol for the atom. 3 electrons orbiting a nucleus. And so what we have here is a Buddha for the New Age, something ancient, a Buddha, combined with something modern, science. And that will be the topic of my comments today. And that brings me to my second and last slide. So you can read this, but I'll read it as well. The religion of the future will be a cosmic religion. It should transcend a personal God and avoid dogmas and theology. Covering both the natural and the spiritual, it should be based on a religious sense arising from the experience of all things, natural and spiritual, as a meaningful unity. If there's any religion that would cope with modern scientific needs, it would be Buddhism. This is Einstein's prophecy. It declares that the religion of the future will not be limited to our small planet, but will encompass the cosmos. All religions have sought to do this, but the implication here is that the religion of the future will do so accurately. Its cosmology based not on fables, but on physics. With scientific insight into the nature of the cosmos, the religion of the future will dispense with the primitive notion of a personal God who created the world and who bestows rewards and metes out punishments to his creatures. This religion will encompass both the spiritual and the natural in a harmonious way. It will require no confessions of faith or assents to propositions that derive from the authority of a scripture, no rituals that reenact forgotten myths. It will have no dogma, no church. There will be no damnation, only salvation, a salvation not through grace, but through experience, the experience of the individual's sense of oneness with the universe. And finally, it will be compatible with science. This will be the religion of the future, but it is a religion that already exists. It is indeed an ancient religion. It is Buddhism, set forth by the Buddha, the Enlightened One, over 2 millennia ago. But there's a problem. This commonly cited declaration of Einstein appears nowhere in his writings or the records of his conversations. It seems he never said it. But there's something about Buddhism and about the Buddha that caused someone to ascribe this statement to Einstein, the Buddha of the modern age. And since the time when Einstein didn't say this, intimations of deep connections between Buddhism and science have continued right up until today. It's often claimed that it has often been claimed over the past 2 centuries that among the great religions of the world, Buddhism is most compatible with modern science. The nature of this compatibility has fallen over a wide spectrum, with some suggesting that the essential teachings of Buddhism, variously identified, are in no way contradicted by the findings of science, variously enumerated. While others suggest that the Buddha anticipated many of the key discoveries of science, that the Buddha knew more than 2 millennia in the past what scientists would only discover more than 2 millennia in the future. This morning, I will examine the origins of such claims, identify their present manifestations, and consider what is at stake in the conjunction of Buddhism and science. Before doing so, however, it's perhaps useful to provide a very brief description of Buddhism. So, Buddhism traces its history, its origins, back to the teachings of an itinerant mendicant who lived in northern India during the 5th century BCE. His clan name was Gautama. His personal name was Siddhartha. According to traditional accounts, he was born as a prince in a small kingdom in what is today southern Nepal. Shielded from the tribulations of life by his father, the king, at the age of 29, he eventually ventured forth from the royal palace, where on separate excursions he encountered a sick man, an old man, a corpse, and a meditating monk. Confronted with the realities then of sickness, aging, death, and the recognition that there are those who seek to escape from them, he departed from the palace, leaving behind his wife and newborn son to seek a state beyond suffering. After 6 years of various forms of spiritual exercises, including extreme asceticism, he sat down under a tree and meditated all night. By dawn, he had become enlightened, Buddha, a Sanskrit word that means awakened, literally. And from that point on, he was known by the title, the Buddha, the awakened one, because he had awakened from the sleep of ignorance. He decided to teach others what he had learned, seeking out his 5 former fellow ascetics to whom he delivered his first sermon. He set forth what are known as the 4 Noble Truths: suffering, origin, cessation, path. The first truth is that existence is qualified by suffering. Like other Indian teachers of the day, the Buddha believed in rebirth, that beings are reborn in various states throughout the universe. In Buddhism, these states are generally enumerated as 6: gods, demigods, humans, animals, ghosts, and hell beings. Although the sufferings undergone in the hot and cold hells are greater than those experienced in the heavens of the gods, each of the 6 abodes is ultimately unsatisfactory in one way or another, and all are unsatisfactory in the sense that even the happiest experiences eventually come to an end and one must be reborn elsewhere. The second truth, the truth of origin, explains why this is the case. The Buddha asserted that suffering is caused by karma, a Sanskrit word that simply means action. He denied the existence of an eternal God who is creator and judge, holding instead that experiences of pleasure and pain, and indeed the very environment in which they occur, are the results of past deeds. Virtuous deeds done in the past result in feelings of pleasure in the future, a future that can occur in this lifetime or any lifetime hence. Non-virtuous deeds done in the past result in feelings of pain in the future. Virtue and non-virtue are generally defined as helping and harming others, respectively, but they are also enumerated under the headings of body, speech, and mind. Hence, killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, those are called physical non-virtues. Lying, divisive speech, harsh speech, senseless speech, those are called verbal non-virtues. Covetousness, harmful intent, wrong view, those are the mental non-virtues. These negative deeds are in turn motivated by a variety of negative mental states, the most important of which are 3: desire, hatred, and ignorance, called the 3 poisons. Among these, ignorance is identified as the root cause of all suffering. Although the nature of this ignorance is among the most extensively examined questions in Buddhist thought, it's generally defined as the belief in self. That among the physical and mental constituents of the person, it's the belief that there is a permanent, partless, autonomous self that is the owner of mind and body and that moves from one lifetime to the next. The belief in this self is the fundamental error, according to the Buddha, and the root cause of all suffering in the universe. The third truth is called the truth of cessation. and this postulates the existence of a state in which suffering has been destroyed. The existence of such a state may be inferred from the process by which suffering is produced. That is, suffering is caused by negative deeds. Negative deeds are motivated by desire and hatred. Desire and hatred result from ignorance. Thus, if ignorance can be destroyed, there can be no desire and hatred. Without desire and hatred, there can be no negative deeds. Without negative deeds, there can be no suffering. The Buddha called the state of cessation of all suffering and rebirth with the term nirvana. The fourth and final truth is the truth of the path to that cessation. The path is described in many ways in Buddhist literature. One of the most succinct is called the three trainings: the training in ethics, in meditation, and in wisdom. Ethical deeds, defined as the control of body and speech, result in states of happiness within the cycle of rebirth, but good deeds alone cannot bring about liberation from rebirth. Meditation here refers to practices that focus the mind, overcoming the ordinary state of mental distraction to produce a state of one-pointed concentration on a given object. Wisdom is the insight into the nature of reality, not simply intellectually, but at a level of deep concentration. The precise content of this wisdom is a topic of detailed discourse in Buddhism, but it is most often described as understanding that there is no self to be found among the constituents of mind and body. Upon hearing the Buddha's first sermon, which I've just summarized, the 5 ascetics all became enlightened. No? Okay. The Buddha continued to teach over a long career, traveling through northern India, where he received the patronage of kings and merchants. He established an order of monks and nuns that continues up to the present day. 45 years after his enlightenment, he died, or in the language of the tradition, he passed into nirvana, never to be reborn again. The Buddha wrote nothing during his lifetime. In keeping with the ancient Indian traditions, his teachings were preserved orally. They did not begin to be committed to writing until some 4 centuries after his death. Around the beginning of the Common Era, new texts, referred to as Mahayana Sutras, began to appear, claiming to be the word of the Buddha. How much of it can be traced directly to him is a question that has been a point of contention among Buddhists and scholars of Buddhism for many, many years. In the centuries after his death, the Buddha's teachings and those attributed to him were spread by monks and nuns throughout Asia, from Afghanistan in the west to Japan in the east, from Mongolia in the north to Indonesia in the south. Monasteries were founded and texts were translated. The tradition grew and changed in significant ways, so much so that some scholars prefer to speak of several Buddhisms rather than a single Buddhism. Prior to the 19th century, European scholars divided the peoples of the world into 4 nations: Christians, Jews, Mohammedans, and idolaters. The Buddhists encountered across Asia by European explorers, travelers, and Roman Catholic missionaries were placed in the last category. The statues of the Buddha were regarded as idols. It was only in the 19th century that the Buddha was identified with certainty as a historical figure of Indian origin, no longer a stone idol, but the founder of a great religion. European travelers encountered Buddhism all over Asia, but not in India, the land of the Buddha's birth. By the 14th century, Buddhism had all but disappeared from India. The reasons for its disappearance were complex. The invasion of northern India by Muslim armies, one of many causes. But its consequences were profound. For by the 19th century, when European scholars trained in South Asian languages began a sustained study of the culture and history of India, what they would come to call Buddhism was an artifact. There were no Buddhists in India, although there were Buddhists every place else in Asia. Instead, India had monuments, often in ruins, cave temples overgrown by jungle, and statues often broken. There were stone inscriptions to be deciphered, There were Sanskrit manuscripts preserved in Nepal to the north of India, and Pali manuscripts preserved in Sri Lanka to the south of India. These were the materials from which European philologists would build their Buddhism. The 19th century thus saw the birth of what has been called the scientific discovery of Buddhism. That is, the study of Buddhism by scholars who could read Buddhist texts in the original languages. This was made possible by significant advances in the science of philology, with the discovery of language families and ancient connections between the classical Indian languages of Sanskrit and the classical European languages of Greek and Latin, as well as modern German, French, and English. These were called the Indo-European or Aryan languages. Aryan is, in fact, a Sanskrit term, meaning noble or superior, and was the name that ancient peoples of northern India used to refer to themselves. Through a complicated process, theories of language groups eventually gave rise to theories of racial groups. The kinship between the people of ancient India and the people of ancient Greece, and hence, through a certain leap of faith, those of modern Europe, became not simply a matter of verb roots, but of bloodlines. Because there were no Buddhists living in India during the colonial period, the Buddhism of India, the first Buddhism, became the domain of European and later American and then Japanese scholars. In 1844, the great French Sanskritist Eugène Burnouf argued convincingly that Buddhism is an Indian religion and that it must be understood first through texts in Indian languages, not Chinese, not Japanese, not Korean, not Tibetan, but Sanskrit. For the remainder of the 19th century then, India became the primary focus of Buddhist studies in Europe, and Sanskrit became the lingua franca of the field. Much of the early scholarship focused on the life of the Buddha and on the early history of Buddhism in India prior to its demise there, and it was referred to by such names as original Buddhism, primitive Buddhism, even pure Buddhism. This austere system of ethics and philosophy stood in sharp contrast to what was perceived as the spiritual and sensuous exoticism of colonial India, where Buddhism was long dead. This ancient Buddhism, derived from the textual studies of scholars in the libraries of Europe, could be regarded as the authentic form of this great religion against which the various Buddhisms of 19th century Asia could be measured and always found to be lacking. Buddhism thus came to be regarded as a tradition that resided most authentically not in its people, but in its texts, such that it could be effectively studied from the libraries of Europe. Many of the great scholars of the day never set foot in Asia. They created a Buddha and a Buddhism unknown at the time in Asia, and that may never have existed there before the late 19th century. Just as there was a quest for the historical Jesus, there was a quest for the historical Buddha, and European Orientalists felt that they had found him. Their Buddha was not so foreign. He was, in fact, racially an Aryan, unique among the founders of the world religions. Abraham, Jesus, Muhammad were all Semites. But the nobility of the prince was not only hereditary, he was also noble because he renounced his royal birth to achieve a spiritual nobility. He was portrayed as a great reformer, described by some as the Luther of Asia, who condemned the vapid priestcraft of the Brahmins and the caste system they controlled. In a Europe obsessed with questions of race and questions of humanity, the Buddha was both racially superior and a savior to all humanity, an ancient kinsman, a modern hero. Furthermore, his ancient teachings, as represented by Victorian scholars, seemed most modern. Buddhism, then, could be hailed as a religion whose founder was neither a god nor a prophet of God, but a man. This man, through his own efforts and through his own investigations, discovered the nature of the universe and then compassionately taught it to others. This Buddha described a universe that was not created by God, but that functioned according to laws of cause and effect. These laws were not limited to the material world, but extended also to the moral realm, where virtue leads eventually to happiness and sin to suffering. Not through the whims of a capricious deity, but through the natural law of karma. This Buddha understood the mechanisms of the mind in precise detail, explaining how desire, hatred, and ignorance motivate actions that eventually result in all manner of physical and mental pain. And he set forth techniques for bringing the chattering mind and the unruly emotions under control in order to reach a state of serenity. Beyond this, he analyzed the myriad constituents that together we call the person, finding among them nothing that lasts longer than an instant. Thus he discovered through his analysis that there is no self, that there is no soul, that what we call the person is but a psychophysical process, and that the realization of this fundamental truth results in a certain liberation. The Buddha then extended this analysis to the phenomena of the universe, declaring the universal truth of praticca samutpada, dependent origination, according to which everything is interrelated, each entity connected to something, nothing standing alone, with effects depending on their causes, wholes depending on their parts, and everything depending on the consciousness that perceives it, appearing differently depending on one's perspective. Yet, whether wave or particle, there is no uncertainty about the ultimate nature of reality, which the Buddha calls shunyata, or emptiness. Emptiness is not nothingness. It is the absence of what is called swabhava, self-nature, a false quality projected upon the objects of our experience by ignorance and removed by wisdom. This Buddha's discoveries were not limited to psychological truths and philosophical insights. He described multiple universes, each with its own sun, universes that arose out of nothingness and returned to nothingness over the course of vast cosmic phases of creation, abiding and disintegration, measured in massive units of time called countless aeons. And he explained how countless beings are born in these universes across these aeons, each moving through a process of spiritual evolution to a state of perfect wisdom. This Buddha discovered these truths not through revelation, but through investigation and analysis, testing hypotheses in the laboratory of his mind to arrive at his conclusions. He articulated these truths in his teachings, truths that derive not from faith, but from the Buddha's own experience. And when he died, he did not ascend into heaven. He lay down between two trees and said to his monks, quote, "All conditioned things are subject to decay. Strive on with diligence." Then he passed away like a flame going out. For Europeans and Americans seeking an alternative to theistic religions who sought to preserve religion, or at least a religion in the light of science, this was a Buddha to whom all manner of scientific insights could be ascribed, from the mechanisms of the universe to the structure of the atom, from a natural law of morality to the deepest workings of the mind. His was a religion, if it was a religion at all, that required no dogma, no faith, no divinely inspired scriptures, no ritual, no worship of images, no God. Buddhism was a tradition that saw the universe as subject to natural laws without the need for any form of divine intervention. This led many European enthusiasts to declare Buddhism as the religion most suited to the modern world, most suited to serious dialogue with science, because both postulated the existence of immutable laws that govern the universe. This Buddha was rather different from the Buddha whose words were recited and whose image was venerated across Asia. Despite the chronological and geographical range of the Buddhist tradition, the Buddha is portrayed with great consistency in Asia. He was believed to have perfected himself over the course of millions of lifetimes as a bodhisattva, performing the virtuous deeds called perfections. He was believed to have taken rebirth in heaven in his penultimate life, where he perused the world to select the city of his final birth, his caste, his clan, his parents. He was believed to have achieved enlightenment at the age of 35, sitting under a tree along the banks of a river. With this enlightenment, he was believed to possess all manner of supernormal powers, including full knowledge of all of his past lives, as well as the lives of all other beings, the ability to know others' thoughts, the ability to create doubles of himself, the ability to rise into the air and simultaneously shoot fire and water from his body. Although he passed into nirvana at the age of 81, he could have lived, as the texts say, for an aeon or till the end of the aeon, if he had only been asked to do so. Rather than narrating the events of his final lifetime, the traditional biographies of the Buddha, which did not appear until 4 centuries after his death, seem more intent on describing his previous lives and the previous Buddhas he encountered along the way. For he was but one of many Buddhas. Each taught the same truth, the same path to liberation from suffering. Indeed, all Buddhas are said to be remarkably similar in word and deed. They differ from each other in just a few ways, one of which is the circumference of their aura. The Buddha who'd been created in Europe did not remain there. By the latter half of the 19th century, much of Buddhist Asia had come under European control. Ceylon and Burma were British colonies. Indochina was a French colony. Although China, Korea, Japan, and Tibet did not come under direct European or American control, they each had varying degrees of contact with Europe, including the establishment of Christian missions. As in the classical economy, as in the classical colonial economy, raw materials, in this case, Buddhist texts in Sanskrit and Pali, were extracted from the colony and shipped to Europe, where they were refined to produce a new Buddha, one who had not existed before. And to complete the colonial circuit, that Buddha was then exported back to Asia, where he was sold to Asian Buddhists who sent him into battle against the Christians. Christian missionaries in Asia continued to regard Buddhism as idolatry and Buddhists as heathens, and sought to demonstrate the errors of Buddhism, sometimes condemning it as superstition, sometimes as a form of paganism. To counter these claims, Buddhist leaders claimed that Buddhism was in fact superior to Christianity, in part because it was more compatible with science. At a lecture delivered at the town hall in New York in 1925, the Sinhalese activist Anakataka Dharmapala declared the following, quote, "The message of the Buddha that I have to bring to you is free from theology, priestcraft, rituals, ceremonies, dogmas, heavens, hells, and other theological shibboleths. The Buddha taught to the civilized Aryans of India 25 centuries ago a scientific religion containing the highest individualistic, altruistic ethics, a philosophy of life built on psychological mysticism, and a cosmogony in harmony with geology, astronomy, radioactivity, and relativity. No creator God can create an ever-changing, ever-existing cosmos. Countless billions of aeons ago, the Earth was existing but undergoing change, and there are billions of solar systems that had existed and exist and shall exist," end quote. In China, the challenge came not only from Christian missionaries, but from a growing community of Chinese intellectuals who saw Buddhism as one of several forms of primitive superstition that were preventing China's entry into the modern world. For them, Buddhist practice was fraught with ghosts and demons, and Buddhism was life-denying. As a religion imported from India long ago, Buddhism had been periodically regarded with suspicion by the state over the course of Chinese history and had been subjected to imperial persecution on 4 occasions. Criticism of Buddhism intensified in the early decades of the 20th century, especially after the Republican Revolution of 1911, when Buddhism was denounced both by Christian missionaries and by Chinese students who were returning from studies abroad, among whom the works of John Dewey and Karl Marx were particularly popular. Again, the new Buddha was sent into battle, with some Chinese monks claiming that science can confirm the insights of the Buddha, but science is incapable of gaining those insights through its own means. Rather, in order to penetrate beyond appearances to the true nature of reality, science is inadequate. Instead, to understand reality fully, one must achieve Buddhahood. In the last decades of the 19th century, Buddhism was also under attack in Japan. In an effort to demonstrate the relevance of Buddhism to the larger interests of the Japanese nation, Buddhist leaders sought to promote what they called a new Buddhism that would play an active role in Japan's attempt to modernize and expand. In the early years of the Meiji period, Buddhism was portrayed as a foreign and anachronistic religion, riddled with corruption, a parasite on society, and the purveyor of superstition, impeding Japan from taking its rightful place among the great nations of the modern world. The new Buddhism that was espoused in response to such charges, was represented as both purely Japanese and purely Buddhist. More Buddhist, in fact, than the other Buddhisms of Asia, especially those of China and Korea, which many Japanese Buddhist leaders conceded were in fact corrupt. The new Buddhism was also committed to social welfare, urging the foundation of public education, hospitals and charities, and it supported the military expansion of the Japanese Empire. Finally, it was consistent with modern science. Although the various Buddhist thinkers each offered a somewhat different view from the other, together they regarded Buddhism as that religion most compatible with science, although they also held that Buddhism offers access to states of wisdom that science alone can never attain. Some went so far as to declare that Buddhism was not a religion at all, but was itself a science of the mind. The implications of this claim become clear in the light of the theories of social evolution of the day, which saw an inevitable advance of humanity from the state of primitive superstition to religion to science. By claiming it to be a science, Buddhism, condemned as a primitive superstition both by European missionaries and by Asian modernists, jumped from the bottom of the evolutionary scale to the top, completely bypassing the category of religion altogether. The discourse of Buddhism and science remained relatively dormant during the 1940s and 50s, with the exception of parallels being drawn between psychoanalysis and Zen, inspired by the works of D.T. Suzuki. It reemerged in the 1960s with the efflorescence of interest in Asian religions and Eastern wisdom. The signal publication during this period was the improbable bestseller, The Tao of Physics, published in 1975. This work went on to become a classic of the New Age, selling more than 1 million copies. Its author, Fritjof Capra, was a physicist rather than a student of Buddhism, and thus relied on secondary sources for his portrayal of Buddhist thought. As was the case with a number of works of this period, Capra spoke more of Eastern mysticism rather than of a specific tradition. This mysticism included then insights not only from Buddhism, but from Hinduism and Taoism as well. And in his book, he writes, quote, "The argument of this book could therefore be phrased more generally by saying that modern physics leads us to a view of the world which is very similar to the views held by mystics of all ages and traditions. Mystical traditions are present in all religions, and mystical elements can be found in many schools of Western philosophy. The parallels to modern physics appear not only in the Vedas of Hinduism, in the I Ching, or in the Buddhist sutras, but also in the fragments of Heraclitus, in the Sufism of Ibn Arabi, or in the teachings of the Yaqui sorcerer Don Juan, whom some of you may remember." End quote. Like the theosophists of the 19th century, Capra sees a deep foundation from which all mystical traditions arise, a tradition that both anticipates and is confirmed by what he calls the new physics. Both mysticism and modern physics derive their insights from empirical methods, yet those insights cannot be expressed in words, he says. They thus remain beyond the comprehension of those who are neither mystics nor physicists. As he writes, quote, "A page from a journal of modern experimental physics will be as mysterious to the uninitiated as a Tibetan mandala. Both are inquiries into the nature of the universe," end quote. For the mystic, the result of his inquiry is, in Capra's words, a direct, non-intellectual experience of reality. Since the 1980s, the 14th Dalai Lama of Tibet has been the most visible and influential Buddhist teacher to embrace the discourse of Buddhism and science. Born in 1935 in a distant corner of the Tibetan cultural domain, he was identified as a young boy as the 14th incarnation of the Dalai Lama, a lineage of Buddhist teachers that extends back to the 15th century. Since 1642, the Dalai Lamas have also been the temporal rulers of Tibet. The 14th Dalai Lama, the current Dalai Lama, displayed an interest in mechanical things from the time of his tutelage in the Potala Palace in Lhasa, where he discovered various European gadgets that had been given as gifts to his predecessor. The People's Liberation Army invaded Tibet in 1950, and the Dalai Lama assumed the position of head of state, traveling in 1954 to China, where he was impressed by Chinese feats of engineering. During a failed uprising, Tibetan uprising against the occupying army in March 1959, the Dalai Lama escaped to India, where he has lived ever since. He made his first trip to the U.S. in 1979 and has traveled extensively since then, often meeting with scientists and researchers to discuss a wide range of topics from cosmology to neurology. Due in part to his interests, over the past 20 years, the effects of Buddhist meditation have begun to be measured by neurologists, adding a new dimension to Buddhism and science. The assertions being made in this domain, that is the domain of meditation research, are qualitatively different from the assertion that the Buddha understood the theory of relativity. The claim here is that Buddhist meditation works. However, in order to understand the laboratory findings, such a claim requires that one first identify what is Buddhist about this meditation, describe what the term meditation encompasses in this case, and perhaps most importantly, explain what works might mean, especially in the context of the exalted goals that have traditionally been ascribed to Buddhist practice. Although these goals are numerous and are variously articulated across the tradition, it can be said that the ultimate goal of Buddhist practice is not self-help, but instead a radical reorientation toward the world, and in many articulations, a liberation from it, either for oneself or for all beings in the universe. Through these various peregrinations, the discourse of Buddhism and science has survived from the 19th through the 20th and now into the 21st century. It began in the arena of polemics, with Buddhists seeking to defend their religion against the attacks of Christian missionaries. By the time that the first claims of affinity between Buddhism and science began to be made in Asia in the late 19th century, science had come to carry connotations of authority, validation, and truth, separate from, and in some cases in conflict with, the truths of the Christian church. It's therefore perhaps unsurprising that Buddhist leaders in Asia would point to what they identified as the scientific aspects of Buddhism in their effort to trump the charges of idolatry and superstition leveled at them by Christian missionaries across the Buddhist world. They argued that the Buddha knew long ago what the science of the Christian West was only now discovering, whether it was the mechanisms of causation that rely on no God, the analysis of experiences into their component parts, the subtle disintegration of matter called impermanence, or the existence of multiple universes. In this first stage, Buddhism meant the philosophy of the Buddha, as European Orientalists understood him, an aristocratic teacher who rebelled against the corrupt priestcraft of his day to teach an ethical system that required no God and which opened the path to freedom from suffering to all humanity. Asian Buddhists and European enthusiasts could thus claim Buddhism as the most modern of the world religions, able to uphold morality without the need for an angry creator God, and as the most scientific, fully in accord with the science of the day, which described a mechanistic universe of cause and effect. In the period after the Second World War, this science was displaced by Einstein's theories, and original Buddhism was displaced by Zen, especially as set forth by D.T. Suzuki. The focus turned from cause and effect to relativity, and from the law of karma to interdependence, through creative readings of Nagarjuna's statements on praticca samutpada, dependent origination. In more recent years, expositions of emptiness and quantum physics have continued, although now drawing on Tibetan interpretations of Indian Buddhist doctrine, with the new element added, the relation of Buddhism to cognitive science, especially through laboratory investigations of the effects of Buddhist meditation on the brain. Thus, in each of its periods of conjunction with science, a different form of Buddhism has been called upon to play its part. Over the century and a half of its association with Buddhism, science has also meant many things. At times, science has meant a method of sober and rational investigation, with the claim that the Buddha made use of such a method to arrive at the knowledge of deep truths about inner and outer worlds. At other times, science refers to a specific theory, the mechanistic universe, the theory of evolution, the theory of relativity, the Big Bang, whose antecedents are to be found in Buddhist doctrine. At other times, science has referred to a specific technology, this microscope, the telescope, the spectrometer, that have been used to discover what the Buddha knew without the aid of such instruments. As more precise instruments have been developed over the past century, the claims of the Buddha's knowledge have remained consistent. And at other times, science has referred to the manipulation of matter with dire consequences for humanity unless paired with the compassionate vision of the Buddha. The referent of Buddhism and the referent of science have thus changed radically over the course of more than a century, yet the claim of the compatibility of Buddhism and science has continued to be made with a remarkable rhetorical consistency. And in each case, in order for the claim to be made, each term must be radically restricted. Buddhism becomes a single tradition, and within that tradition, an isolated set of elite doctrines and practices, eliminating so much of what has been deemed essential, whatever that might be, to the exalted monks and nuns and ordinary lay people who've gone for refuge to the Buddha over the course of more than 2,000 years. The term science is often restricted to such an extent that it becomes like a mantra, a potent sound with no semantic value. Buddhists first encountered science, perhaps ironically, in the guise of Christianity. It was a superior knowledge, a knowledge that Christianity possessed and Buddhism did not, thus providing yet further proof of the superiority of Christianity, and hence a tool of the missionary and a reason for conversion. Later, science would be portrayed as the product of a more generalized European civilization, something that this civilization would take around the world. The vehicle for that journey was colonialism. The modern Buddhists of the late 19th century and early 20th century thus had good reason to try to claim science for themselves, whether to counter the missionaries' charge that Buddhism was superstition and idolatry, or to counter the colonialist claim that the Asian was prone to fanciful flights of mind and meaningless rituals of body. For this, science proved the ideal weapon. It was Buddhism, in fact, that was the scientific religion, the religion best suited for modernity throughout the world. It was an Asian, the Buddha, who knew millennia ago what the European was just beginning to discover. This latter point, of course, was only made possible through the strange international network that invented the Buddha as we know him today. A century later, the missionaries have not gone away, but their inroads into Buddhist societies are largely confined to specific times and places of the past. And European colonialism, in its classical form, has died out. Yet, the discourse of Buddhism and science persists, unchanged in so many ways. The enemy is slain, the weapon continues to be wielded. The inevitable links between nation and science help to explain why today the most famous proponent for the links between Buddhism and science is none other than the Dalai Lama, who has struggled for half a century for the independence of his country, perhaps still seeking to demonstrate that Tibetan Buddhism is not the primitive superstition that the European Orientalists saw in the 19th century and that the Chinese Communist Party saw in the 20th. Rather, Tibetan Buddhism is presented as a worthy interlocutor of science and hence an appropriate ideology of a modern nation that one day might exist. Yet, despite the persistence of claims for their compatibility, Buddhism and science, however those terms are defined, are different in fundamental ways. In the scientific method, at least in its idealized form, reality or truth, whatever that term might connote in a given case, has not yet been discovered. Hypothesis and experiment are employed to arrive at a truth that is at the time unknown, or at least unverified. That truth can change, and has changed many times over the history of science, with a new truth sometimes refining an old truth, sometimes completely replacing it. The image is one of augmentation and revision, moving toward an ever-receding horizon of omniscience, a theory of everything. Over the long and varied development of the Buddhist traditions, there remains the shared belief that the nature of reality was discovered long ago by the Buddha, and before him by the Buddhas of the distant past, and that same reality was understood by all the Buddhas in its entirety and in its fullness. This reality is represented not as something that the Buddha was the first to discover, but which he rediscovered. In a famous metaphor, the Buddha describes a traveler coming across an ancient city at the end of an ancient path through the great forest. A once great city, now deserted and in ruin. The traveler informs the king, who restores the city to its former glory. The Buddha is that traveler, discovering the same path to enlightenment that the Buddhas of the past had found. Thus, in Buddhism, the truth is something that is found and then lost and then found again. This is why it's said that the next Buddha does not appear in the world until the teachings of the previous Buddha have been completely forgotten. And as long as the path to the city of reality remains passable and the city itself remains prosperous, there's no reason for repair. But when the city falls into ruins and the path is overgrown with oblivion, then the path must be cleared again and the city restored. This is what the Buddhas do again and again over the aeons. In a sense, then, Buddhism is profoundly retrospective, looking to the past to understand the present, thereby securing a safe haven from a hazardous future. And there is a certain comfort in the knowledge that the course to that haven has already been clearly charted. There is a comfort in the knowledge that the voyage has already been navigated. There is a comfort in the knowledge that the other shore has been reached. Science, in the popular representation, offers a different appeal, an appeal to the quest for what has never been known by anyone, yet is somehow there, waiting to be discovered, if we just knew how to find it. In the meantime, we must live in doubt of our deepest knowledge. Perhaps this is why we yearn for the teachings of an itinerant mendicant in Iron Age India, even one of such profound insight, to somehow anticipate the formulas of Einstein. Thank you.
Saturday Morning Physics is sponsored by the Physics Department of the University of Michigan, by the Dr. M. Lois Tiffany Endowment, and by gifts from friends of the program.